The remains of Portland's historical downtown Albina area consists of a few blocks of old buildings along Russell Street. A strangely high number of murder cases have happened in and around this short stretch during the early 1900s. Most notably, the assault and murder of 5-year-old Barbara Holtzman in 1911, arguably Portland's most grisly unsolved murder. Just 2 blocks away, the Dewdrop Inn murder happened the same year. And in the middle of all this historic architecture stands the Davis Block, built in 1890. In 1921, the proprietor of the rooming house there, a John Burns, would become mixed up in the murder of a railroad agent on June 14, 1921. Burns' accomplice, Dan Casey, was apprehended hiding in that building. Lots of murder, lots of intrigue, and it only got crazier as, 5 weeks after this murder, another likely murder victim would be discovered, and discovered in a place not so far away from Davis Block. In what is today a fenced-off lot with a few buildings there, this area once housed a structure that had been known as the Richardson Dance Hall. It stood on what is today North Albina Avenue, between Russell and Knott Streets. I spent extensive time looking for a picture of this particular hall as, while it was being renovated in 1921 for updated commercial use, by the mid-1940s it was gone. Nothing but trees where it once stood. But, thanks to Vintage Portland, I found this picture overlooking the Albina area from 1928. Directly behind Davis Block, we see this building. Even in a blurry state, the building has a dance hall look to it. Built circa 1890, the hall had also functioned as a mission for destitute persons, a showroom for an auto wrecking company, and had living quarters on the second floor. So here I am on Albina Avenue, between Russell Avenue in front of me and Russell Street in front of me, Knott Street behind me. And here's the back side of Davis Block. And in my initial video, because the address, if you translate the address of the old dance hall from the 1910s and 20s to what it would have been after the big address switch that occurred in this city during the early 1930s, it would have put the dance hall's address pretty much right over here where these trucks are, where this big trailer was. So I initially inferred that the dance hall would have been about where this, fenced off gravel driveway is. And, in the information they discuss how there was a door that led from the dance hall into a saloon next door, and I just assumed, thinking it was here, that the saloon that led into may have been in Davis Block, because down the first floor level is all storefronts and stuff, and there could have been a saloon in here at one point. But the photograph that I found from 1928 showed nothing here, but rather a building that looked more or less like it could have been a small dance hall that would have been more pretty much from the edge of this kind of fading green building to the start of that building, kind of primarily where this driveway is. That would have been primary. And then on the other side of this building along Knott Street there, it was just lined with small houses. And there was also in the picture, it appears they were hidden in the trees, kind of right here along the edge of this building here, there were 2 homes that were kind of hidden in the trees. And then these structures over here have all been here for a long time, and Davis Block here predates 1900, so it would have been here quite a while when this case occurred. But by 1921, the building had sat vacant for several years, and the owner, J.D. Chambers, wanted it revived for new use. Construction workers, hired by J.D. Chambers, were digging a hole in the space beneath the building's main floor for the placement of a jack to elevate the building. Dark, and with the evening coming, a worker dug in the darkness, throwing the earth he dug up into a pile behind him, as you do. Fortunately, as this worker hadn't noticed, he dug up more than just dirt, and a fellow worker noticed these items in the pile. They included a, quote, dainty dancing slipper, a size 4.5 pair of heeled leather shoes, a portion of a corset, a black comb, and a wedding ring. But beyond that, the workers were shocked to find a mix of human bones there in the dirt. Authorities were quickly called to begin processing a crime scene. Altogether, these bones, belonging to a woman, included 2 thigh bones, 2 shin bones, a small unidentifiable bone, and the upper portion of a skull, missing its jawbone. These circumstances quickly led law enforcement to deem this was a murder case. It was noted that a trap door led from the main floor to this space underneath the building, and that it nearly lined up with where the bones were unearthed. Quickly, the theory became that wherever this woman had actually been killed, she had been brought down through this trap door and buried in a shallow grave. There was another door within feet of this trap door that adjoined the dance hall with a building that had functioned as a saloon at one time. Both the dance hall and the saloon had been described as, quote, notorious. No explanation for why. This left open room to consider that the victim had been killed and or transferred from the saloon into the dance hall and then through the trap door to the space below. Before this, it had been briefly considered that medical students had left these bones here, as this was, strangely enough, a common thing that happened during this time. However, there was no evidence to defend this. It didn't explain the clothing items found there, and the location where the bones were found was a difficult place to reach just to pull off a burying the bones prank. This theory was dismissed almost as quickly as it was considered. Aside from these running possibilities, the police appeared to have little to go on during that first day. The coroner suggested these bones had been there possibly as long as 10 years, making it potentially more difficult to solve the case. Immediately, leading investigators focused on the middle 1910s as the time when the murder took place, the last period of time before the hall became vacant. In what would prove to be the most critical piece of evidence in the case, the previously mentioned wedding ring found at the scene had an inscription on it that said, quote, Billy to Vera, unquote, with the date 12/10/09. The spelling of Billy's name varied depending on what newspaper you read, some spelling it Billy and others spelling it Billie. This was the only break the police had, as they had a potential name for the victim, Vera. This Vera had also apparently been married, presumably to a person named Billy, on December 10th, 1909. But even this initial lead led to a dead end, with authorities finding no marriages for anyone named Vera or Billy on that date in the Portland, Vancouver, or Oregon City areas. Certainly, Vera and Billy could have been married far away and ultimately found themselves in Portland at a later date. But for a couple days, authorities had nothing to go on. A break. Vera White, a resident of either Castle Rock, Oregon or Castle Rock, Washington, the newspapers never said which one, came to the attention of Portland police. It was found that White had gone missing either in 1912 or 1913, and she just happened to be married to a man named Billy, or rather, a man named William Myers. Myers was also nowhere to be found, and law enforcement could not determine exactly when the two had been married, but they presumed that this marriage had occurred in 1909 in order to make the wedding ring fit. There's just one problem with all of this. You see, I managed to discover what the police back then couldn't: the exact date that Vera White and Billy Myers were married. Here, from a May 3rd, 1908 edition of the Oregon Daily Journal, it shows that the two had been married the day before, May 2nd, 1908, not December 10th, 1909. Whoever's remains were found underneath that dance hall, they did not belong to Vera White. But it was all the police had to go on. Off they went on their wild goose chase that would get them nowhere, and, like so many other cases from those more primitive days, the mystery began to fade away. So it was my intention at this point to transition away from the Vera White element of the story, as I found it myself right there that she wasn't married on the date engraved on this wedding ring. It was just a bizarre coincidence, so it seems. But as I started working on this, and I just kind of abruptly transitioned away from this, I wanted to make a point, because I actually tried to look a little deeper and see if I could find anything, and I never found any resolution to the Vera White situation. Here's another person who disappeared several years before these bones were found, and there was no explanation for what happened. But beyond that element alone, I find it extremely intriguing that now that it's 1921, they try to find her husband and the children that they'd had. They couldn't find Billy Myers, her husband, either. The police had no idea what happened to him. It was like a whole family had disappeared. Now again, it was 1921. Vera White had disappeared almost a decade earlier. Maybe in the aftermath of that, Billy Myers relocated somewhere. Back then, it wasn't quite as easy to find people when they relocated. I just found that extremely intriguing and wanted to address that one last time, how bizarre that is, that they, the wife disappears and now suddenly they can't find the husband. Ended up ultimately not having anything to do with this case, but I wanted to address it for that element, but also to just acknowledge the fact that Vera White was another woman who, around 1912, 1913, the police couldn't seem to figure out exactly which year she had vanished. For all we know, she may have met a fate similar or possibly worse than the victim in this case, and I only wish I could have found a resolution to her story to at least put the matter to rest, but that's another situation that just looms on in mystery. After weeks of silence, this case was suddenly thrust back into the news. Back in 2019, I visited the scene where the dance hall once stood and did a video about the case. However, at that time, I assumed the case was an unsolved mystery to this day. I would later find out otherwise. On May 1st, 1921, the news story broke that the remains had finally been identified as those of a 26-year-old woman named Mabel Phillips. The key was that wedding ring. Deceptive initially, it did provide the resolution to the victim's identity. This discovery was made by Mabel's sister, a Mrs. George Mills, who immediately recognized the etchings on the ring. She stated that she and Mabel had had another sister who was married in 1909 and had died a short while later. After her passing, her wedding ring ended up in the possession of Mabel, who wore it frequently. This small detail cinched the case for law enforcement. It would have made no sense for anyone else to be buried with that specific ring. A further possible deception, on the site findagrave.com, I found Mabel Phillips, who was buried in Oregon City, where several of her relatives had lived. A brother, Clyde, who died of consumption in 1903, is the only listed sibling of hers. However, when I looked under her father, an Albert William Phillips, it noted another daughter, but not a Vera Phillips. Rather, it listed a Viva Phillips, V-E-V-A. Either this is a typo, or it means the police were never chasing after a Vera in the first place. Another element of the police's wild goose chase. Honestly, as far as etchings go, a lowercase r and a lowercase v, they could be easily confused. I could find little information on Mabel Phillips before 1914, the presumed year of her death. She was born in January 1888. No specific day of the month was given. She had been born in Los Angeles and specifically had lived in the Hawthorne area of LA before, at some point, moving north to Portland. I can only assume she picked the Portland area to move to because she already had family in that area. One newspaper stated that she had run a house in Portland's notorious North End, which alone could have mixed her up with some of the city's more violent characters. But the beginning of the mystery of her death takes us right back to the Richardson Dance Hall. Mabel placed a phone call to her sister, Mrs. George Mills, telling her that she was going to be coming over for dinner, a dinner that she never made it to. Aside from this, she also mentioned that she was going to a place where 5 men were living. She must have mentioned the exact address of this site, as when Mabel went missing afterward, her brother-in-law, George Mills, went to the location with a friend who happened to be a former Portland police officer. The living quarters there at the dance hall appeared to be in a state of disarray, but Mabel was nowhere to be found. It's likely that she was there, directly beneath their feet. While the police couldn't find enough to bust anyone at the hall, a nationwide search had begun to find Mabel Phillips. A search that obviously went nowhere. Fast forward to 1921, with the revelation of Mabel Phillips's death and the discovery of her body, George Mills divulged more details as to what he had seen in the dance hall's living quarters back in 1914. What was most significant in these details was his statement that he saw dark stains on the floor that he took to be blood stains, and these stains were right next to the trap door, leading straight down to where Mabel's remains were found. This was a very incriminating claim, but it is of interest that Mills seemed to add details to his 1921 retelling that were not there in his initial claims back in 1914. Bloodstains on the floor seems like a pretty significant item to forget. A story quickly began to spread that Mabel had been lured to that location by a couple men living there who felt she had duped them out of some cash. However, this was just, as it was described in newspapers, a, quote, underworld story, a presumption, lots of smoke. But what about the fire? By May 9th, 1921, the name Nick George popped up in the press as a possible suspect in this murder. He was one of the men that had been living at the old dance hall, and he had reportedly been seen with Mabel Phillips before her death. It's worth noting again that she had run a place in Portland's notorious North End, and Nick George was known to also frequent that area. As a matter of fact, by 1921, the last witness who had seen George in the Portland area claimed that, around September 1921, he'd seen him at a pool hall located in the North End. This witness also noted that George had shaved off his customary mustache. Furthermore, this same witness, who must have known George directly, later received a letter from a friend in Montana who stated that George was there with him. This implied that Nick George had fled the Portland area shortly after Mabel Phillips went missing. Very telling. The Montana friend in this letter asked if George was possibly wanted for murder back in Portland. Whatever gave him that idea? Nick George was a man of Greek descent who was living with several other Greek men at the old dance hall in 1914. That was its primary purpose, was just housing for Greek men who worked specifically for the Southern Pacific Railroad, which made sense as the massive Albina rail yards were located just a couple blocks away. Another Greek man who had lived at the dance hall during that time was a man named Tudor Kostic, who also left the area shortly after Mabel's disappearance. A friend of his would state that Kostic asked him to go to the police headquarters on his behalf to help a friend with their bail. Kostic apparently expressed he was fearful of going near a police station in the aftermath of Mabel's disappearance. The fact that George and Kostic had left the area shortly after actually substantiated the account of a man right after the bones had been discovered. Only identified in newspapers as Old John, he claimed he lived behind the dance hall in 1914 and knew full well about the Greek workers who lived there. He stated that during the summer of 1914, without warning and leaving most of their belongings behind, all of these Greeks left the hall in a mass exodus, never to return. And they say this Old John fellow, who was like a primary source to the fact that right after this situation, all of a sudden these Greek railroad workers, they all just split and took off. A lot of them left a bunch of their stuff behind. Now, he said he lived behind the dance hall. Now, that means he could have lived in one of the many small houses that line this stretch between Albina Avenue and Mississippi Avenue. So he could have lived in one of the houses peppering this area. With the dance hall generally ending kind of close to where this building's ending, he may have lived kind of somewhere over here. So like the backside of the building would be like this backside of the building. So he could have lived on Mississippi with his house, the back of his house facing the backside of the dance hall. Again, they never give a specific address for this guy. They just say that he lived behind the dance hall, which means he could have lived here, kind of sort of facing the backside of it, or up on Mississippi Avenue, right down there, other side of this building. Two more men, not of Greek ancestry, who had lived at the old dance hall during that time, a Tiro Ivanhoff and a Pete Chustoff, were interrogated by police and denied any personal knowledge in the case. They both made a point of saying, however, that Nick George could have been responsible for this murder. With all of these details noted, not only Nick George, but several men who'd been living at the dance hall were looking suspicious. But it was still circumstantial. There was no definitive crime scene, a murder witness, or even a cause of death, much less the weapon that may have been used. When the scant evidence that authorities had was brought to a district attorney, an arrest warrant was denied, demanding a need for more evidence. The case against Nick George still had some strength to it. Witnesses said he knew Mabel Phillips personally, he lived at the house where she said she was going, and of course, her body was found right at that location. With his still lingering as a possible suspect and roaming free, I tried to see if I could find any more information on him. I found information between 1914 and 1922 on a few different Nick Georges, none of which can be definitively tied to the one in this case. A Nick George Pantazopoulos got married in California 15 days before Mabel's disappearance. Another Nick George was arrested in Tulare, California, a small town south of Fresno, on July 26, 1921, only 4 days after Mabel disappeared. It might be a stretch that this was the Nick George in question, especially since it was stated that he worked at a restaurant in Tulare. Unless he had just arrived in town and only had the job for a day or so, it seems this Nick George was another individual altogether. However, this Tulare Nick George was arrested for passing a bad check. This gave me pause. Could it be that he was abruptly on the run and in need of cash and stopped off briefly in Tulare to make a little more cash? Again, a stretch, but it did capture my curiosity. Potentially the most interesting account I found came from February 12th, 1914, more than 5 months before Mabel's disappearance. 5 Greek railroad workers were sent to the small town of Pieta, California, near the town of Ukiah, for work. One of these Greeks was named Nick George. These men attacked their foreman when he wouldn't let them relocate to San Francisco. The fact that a Nick George was working here as a transient railroad employee, and a couple months later, our Nick George was living at the dance hall in Portland, where specifically Greek railroad employees were living, makes me wonder, honestly, if these two men were one and the same. Despite these intriguing discoveries, they did not bring me, or the authorities back then for that matter, any closer to finding out what happened to Nick George, if in fact he was even the guilty party. The moment he became a suspect, the authorities were already contemplating the possibility that Nick George had fled America and feared the difficulty of extraditing him based on their circumstantial evidence. The only reference I found post-May 1921 was on findagrave.com under Mabel Phillips's page, wherein Friends of Mountain View Cemetery, where Mabel's remains were buried, stated that the suspects in the murder had left the United States. Wherever they got that information, it further suggests the likelihood that Nick George fled the country after Mabel Phillips was murdered, and he may have not been the only person from the dance hall to do so. All things considered, there was never a definitive resolution in this case, but I am led to believe that the cops got it right, or at least were on the right path. There were certainly reasons to have suspicions about Nick George. That said, others living at the dance hall may have been involved, at least as accomplices, or even witnesses. If George Mills's account is to be believed, seeing the location in disarray with apparent bloodstains on the floor, Mabel was likely killed right there, as opposed to, say, being murdered elsewhere and simply buried under the dance hall. We will likely never know, for an absolute certainty, exactly how things went down or who, specifically, was the killer in this now century-old case. After looking at the evidence recovered in this case, there was something that lingered with me. Where were the rest of Mabel's remains? The bones that were found were in solid condition, so I cannot believe that the rest had completely deteriorated. But no bones from her pelvic area up to her jawbone were ever found. But the bones surrounding that area were. No feet bones were found, and police focused their search on the area specifically where the remains were found. But I saw no evidence that investigators searched that whole space beneath the dance hall, just that one area where the hole was being dug. What I'm getting at is this. I see this as evidence that Mabel Phillips's body was likely dismembered, with her legs and head buried in the area that was dug up. The rest of her body may have been buried under other spaces beneath the dance hall. The rest may have been buried elsewhere. I wonder why the police didn't think of this possible angle, since about 70% of the body's bones were missing. But back during this time, the idea of murder victims being dismembered was beyond a rarity. Even by the time the infamous Cleveland torso killer came about in the mid-1930s, it was still an oddity. But if this was a dismemberment murder specifically, it makes me wonder, were there others? Not to exaggerate, but could this dance hall have actually been a murder hall? I ask this because, considering the presumed story of Mabel Phillips's death, the idea is she was killed, for whatever reason, taken down, and simply buried beneath the hall. There was no need to dismember her under those circumstances, and yet it appears she was. I get the feeling this was more than just an isolated killing. This may have been the act of a sadistic killer, or possibly a group working together. We've never been given a reason why Mabel went there. Was she lured there to be the next one sacrificed? I don't only ponder this point because of the implications that not all of Mabel's body was buried in one spot, but also a succession of stories that came out right after the bones were discovered. During the period of time that police were thinking Vera White was the victim, they were contacted by a Mrs. J. Buckman, who lived in downtown Portland but back in 1914 lived near the Richardson Dance Hall. She told police that her former husband, an A.L. Pangburn, saw a young woman, no older than 18, enter the dance hall with a few Greek men. This woman was reportedly never seen after this. According to Mrs. Buckman, this happened in August 1914, after Mabel Phillips had died. Granted, it was at most only 5 weeks after, but Mabel was pushing 30 years of age and this girl was barely starting adulthood at best. There's little reason to believe that the woman Mr. Pangburn saw was Mabel Phillips. Furthermore, shortly after seeing this, Buckman and Pangburn were visited by a detective who expressed that they were looking for a recently missing girl who lived on Rodney Avenue, only 9 blocks east of where the dance hall was located. This girl was reportedly never found. So was she the same girl seen going into the hall by A.L. Pangburn? So the Pangburns lived in close enough proximity of the dance hall that again would have been generally right here, that they could see people going in and out of it. Now again, the imagery from the late 1920s shows one, possibly two houses kind of in this general vicinity. And then this was kind of more or less open. And right here, this was just a stretch of houses going down Knapp. If you look at the imagery, there was just a stretch of small homes that just went up and down the street here. They could have possibly lived there, however, they wouldn't have had a view of the main entrance, which would have been along Albina Street here. So they could have lived right across the street. This old house over my shoulder here looks fairly old. Maybe it was here in 1914 when they would have seen this. And from that green house right there, they would have had a direct view of this area right here. So they never give an address for where they lived when they were here. They gave an address for the wife, but they'd been divorced by that point, so she was living in the downtown area, not living out here anymore. So I know that address, which isn't relevant to the case, but I don't know exactly where they would have lived. But logic stipulates they would have been along this stretch of knot with kind of a diagonal view towards the front, or they would have lived in one of those two houses right here. But this mystery girl was not the only other strange disappearance to happen in relation to that dance hall at that time. In the March 17, 1921 edition of the Oregon Daily Journal, there was a reference to another Mabel Kelly, who was known to visit the dance hall frequently and who, too, had disappeared and was never found. At least as of 1921. Two more stories of two young women visiting the dance hall in general proximity to where Mabel Phillips died, both of which also vanished, just like she did. Now this is a complicated scenario because it's such an old case and it's so lost to history. There's no follow-up stories after 1921. And it's hard to believe that if this was a case where multiple women were being lured to this house under false pretenses or what have you, and then being killed one by one, it's hard to believe that just one person was doing this with these other people living there. You'd almost think, like, at the very least, these other people would have to be accessories after the fact or potentially accomplices if one person was doing all of this. However, as rare as serial killing was back then, at least compared to the last, 50, 60 years in America, it was actually, if people were killing multiple people, it was actually not super uncommon for groups of people to be involved. A lot of famous, iconically notorious families, the Benders, killed people as a group. And buddy serial killers, where there's two involved, have always been a thing. So it's very possible, if in fact this is what was going on in this dance hall, that everybody there may have been involved. Otherwise, you have to just presume it's a coincidence that over the course of only a couple of months, you have, at least that we know of, 3 different women disappearing. 2 of which were literally seen going into this dance hall and reportedly never seen after that. And then you have Mabel Phillips, who literally, the last time she's heard from alive, she says she's going to that dance hall. So you have 3 people who disappear, all going to the same place over the span of a couple of months. So either these women were being killed, one by one. Women were being lured there to be murdered in a serial killer-like fashion. Or you have to believe that randomly at least 3 different women just happened to all visit this one place in Portland over a short period of time, and they all just magically, 2 of them just magically disappeared, which the odds against that are so extreme. And then you have Mabel Phillips, who visits the place and then randomly turns up dead and buried underneath it. The odds of that being the case are very small, considering the circumstances, which is what, more than anything else, really leads me to believe that this dance hall
It wasn't just this one case. Like, this was almost working like a murder house or a murder hall, where you have these individuals who are all, it's this group of Greeks living together, and they could get away with something like that perceivably, because once they get people in there, who else in there is going to stop them? Nobody's there to witness the crimes. It's this big dance hall. You get somebody in there, you could probably do whatever you wanted to them. It would actually be a pretty decent setup to lure people away and kill them and potentially get rid of them and not be, at least hopefully, not be discovered or have someone learn about your actions immediately afterwards or even way, way down the line. So I think there's definitely something there.
And these are just the instances I could find. Who knows how many other women may have randomly disappeared around 1914, whose names didn't make it to print. It was extremely common at this time for people to run off or disappear, and their families would pay it little mind. How many more murder victims were dismissed as runaways? Maybe none, maybe several. These other two cases did not seem to get the same investigative attention that Mabel's did, right out of the gate. Could this suggest that someone had committed multiple murders in the dance hall, but split after Mabel's murder when things got too hot? Why was there a trap door in the building that literally led down to nothing? Where was the rest of Mabel Phillips? Why did so many women visiting this same spot just up and vanish? Or turn up dead? Again, this is just a working theory. On a whim, I got on the old newspaper database, looking up other women who may have mysteriously vanished in the Portland area around 1914, and there was one case that caught my attention. A Gertrude Sullivan, 29, had recently relocated to Portland from Massachusetts, possibly to join a convent. On February 28, 1914, she left the home of a friend and, as far as I can gather, was never seen again. The house where she was last seen was located near what would have been Union Avenue and Fargo Street back then. This just happened to be less than a mile from the Richardson Dance Hall. Is it possible Gertrude Sullivan was another murder victim? No one can say, but she did disappear in the right area and at the right time for it to make sense. Still, as I've said, these are all theories. Contemplation based on what little is known in a case that has generally been forgotten since the year it happened. Many appeared satisfied enough that the victims had been identified. Whether the killer was caught or not, a minor misfortune. And that's where we are left today. A young woman still seeking justice, and only one suspect to speak of, who disappeared forever. I could find no further information on Nick George, what he did, where he lived, and when he died. Just one more enigma in this case. Was this just an isolated incident, or were there other victims? I hardly went into this project thinking I would leave it, feeling like there may have, at best, been serial killers at work here, but I honestly come away feeling that may very well have been the case. I just wanted to take a fresh look at something I initially felt was still a Jane Doe case, only to find out later that it wasn't. Today, as you've seen, the location where all of this happened is a nondescript lot with a few buildings just off the old historic main drag. Like most wild mysteries, you see it today, and you'd never think for a second that a story like this story could have happened here. And when I look at the grounds here, I wonder, perhaps erroneously, but I really wonder if others are still buried under this land.